In 2008, archaeologists working beneath the streets of Jerusalem made a discovery that no one was prepared for. Deep underground, in a sealed chamber that hadn't been disturbed for over 2,600 years, they found something that shouldn't exist. A stone tablet, ancient script, and an inscription that directly contradicted centuries of religious doctrine. The question became simple: why did the people who knew about this keep it hidden? Archaeology isn't always about finding treasure or gold. Sometimes it's about finding truth. And this truth was so significant that the discovery was quietly kept out of mainstream media for years. Only a handful of scholars, religious officials, and government authorities were allowed to examine it. The rest of the world knew nothing. Jerusalem is built on layers. Thousands of years of history sit stacked on top of each other like pages in a book. To understand what happened below the streets, you have to understand what's above them. For centuries, this city has been fought over, conquered, rebuilt. Each civilization left its mark. The Romans, the Crusaders, the Ottomans. But beneath all that, something older remained. Something that predated all of them. The chamber where this artifact was found wasn't accidental. It was deliberately sealed. The stones were carefully placed. The entrance was hidden behind a wall that had been covered and forgotten. When archaeologists finally broke through, they found dust that had never been disturbed by human hands. Not in centuries. Not in millennia. What made this discovery dangerous wasn't the artifact itself. It was what the artifact proved. It contained evidence of something that official religious history had denied for 2,000 years. Evidence that certain groups knew about this artifact's existence. Evidence that they chose deliberately and systematically to suppress it. The inscription was partially translated within the first week. Scholars stopped speaking to the press immediately after. Religious authorities requested emergency meetings. Government officials became involved. Suddenly, this was no longer just an archaeological discovery. It became a political crisis. A theological crisis. A crisis of authority. One researcher involved in the initial analysis described the moment they understood what the tablet said. She called it, like watching everything you believed shift beneath your feet. Another scholar compared it to a hidden historical bomb. It wasn't just information. It was validation. Confirmation. Proof of something that certain powerful institutions had worked very hard to keep secret. The question every researcher asked was the same. If this artifact was so important, why wasn't it discussed? Why wasn't it published? Why, in an age of transparency and information, did the brightest minds in archaeology and theology agree to silence? The answer to that question requires us to go deeper. Much deeper. Into the hidden networks of religious scholarship. Into the politics of discovery. Into the institutions that decide what we're allowed to know about our own history. But before we do that, we need to understand exactly where this discovery was made. We need to know what was found. And we need to ask ourselves a harder question. What else might be buried down there? Jerusalem's underground is a network of tunnels, chambers, and passages that most people don't know exist. For centuries, archaeologists have explored these hidden spaces. They've found Roman fortifications, Byzantine churches, Crusader strongholds. Each discovery adds another layer to the city's impossible history. But this particular chamber was different. It wasn't connected to any known structure. It wasn't documented in any historical record. Which means someone went to great lengths to hide it. The chamber was discovered accidentally during construction work near the Western Wall. Workers broke through what they thought was just another section of ancient stone. Instead, they found a perfectly preserved room. The air inside was still, undisturbed. The walls were smooth, carefully cut. This wasn't rough or primitive. This was professional, deliberate, built to last. Inside, arranged carefully on a stone shelf, was the tablet. It was made of limestone, about 60 centimeters long, covered in script that carbon dating would later confirm was between 2,600 and 2,700 years old. That places it roughly in the time of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, a period when the city was under extreme stress, when people were desperate, when religious faith was being tested in the most brutal ways imaginable. The script itself was the first puzzle. It wasn't purely Hebrew. It wasn't purely Aramaic. It was a mixture. A hybrid language that suggested communication between groups that weren't supposed to be communicating. Scholars who examined it said it read like a document designed to be understood by multiple cultures, multiple faiths. But here's what made it truly explosive. The tablet contained references to something. Something that existed during that time. Something that people in that era knew about, but that completely contradicts what we've been taught for the last 2,000 years. The inscription mentions specific names, specific dates, specific events that match nothing in any approved historical record. When the initial team of archaeologists realized what they were looking at, everything changed. Calls were made. High-level calls. Within 48 hours, the chamber was sealed again. Not destroyed. As if the authorities wanted to preserve it but also wanted to make sure no one else would find it by accident. The official explanation was that the discovery needed to be studied carefully. That rushing to publish results could damage the scientific integrity of the research. That seemed reasonable at first. But months turned into years. A decade passed. The tablet was studied but nothing was published. No peer review. No academic papers. No conferences. Just silence. Scientists and archaeologists who worked on the project were bound by what's called a non-disclosure agreement. They legally couldn't talk about what they found. Couldn't publish. Couldn't share findings with colleagues. In an age when every other archaeological discovery is celebrated and broadcast, this one was buried. Literally and figuratively. The question becomes unavoidable. Why would multiple governments, multiple religious institutions, and the academic establishment all agree to suppress evidence? What kind of truth requires this level of coordination? What could this tablet possibly say that's worth decades of organized silence? If this story is revealing things you've never considered, you know what comes next. Subscribe. Because the actual evidence is far stranger than anyone expected. Religious scholars are trained to study history, to examine texts, to analyze evidence. They spend decades learning languages, learning interpretation, learning how to read ancient documents and extract meaning from them. So when a tablet emerges that contains information about a critical moment in religious history, these scholars should be the most excited people on earth. They should be publishing papers, debating findings, pushing the boundaries of what we understand about our past. Instead, they went silent. One retired scholar, speaking anonymously years later, described what happened when she first saw the translations. She said that some of her colleagues actually refused to look at the evidence. Not because it was unclear. Not because it was scientifically questionable. But because they already knew what it would mean if they acknowledged it. And they weren't willing to face that. The tablet contained something that both Christian and Islamic scholars found deeply uncomfortable. It contained proof that certain groups knew something. Something that contradicted official religious narratives. Something that suggested those narratives were incomplete. Or worse, deliberately altered. Here's what makes this significant. Religious history isn't just academic. It's foundational to billions of people's identities. It's connected to land claims, to cultural authority, to spiritual legitimacy. When you challenge religious history, you're not just arguing about ancient events. You're threatening the authority structures that depend on those stories being true. The scholars who examined the tablet faced an impossible choice. They could publish their findings and become pariahs within their own fields. They could face accusations of bias. They could endure attacks from religious institutions that felt threatened. Or they could stay silent. Protect their careers. Protect their reputations. Protect the peace. Most chose silence. But some didn't. A few scholars attempted to publish their findings in academic journals. Those papers were rejected. Not for methodological reasons. The methodology was sound. The evidence was real. The papers were rejected because of what they suggested. Because of the implications. One researcher spent 3 years trying to publish in peer-reviewed journals. Every submission was rejected. When she finally asked why, an editor told her candidly that publishing the findings would create a firestorm. That it would cause religious conflict. That the academic community had already discussed it informally and decided that some truths weren't worth publishing. That's not how science is supposed to work. Science is supposed to be about evidence. About following data wherever it leads. But when data leads somewhere that threatens powerful institutions, suddenly the process becomes political. The tablet's inscriptions mention something specific. Something that appears nowhere else in any official historical record from that time period. It mentioned contact. Communication. Coordination between groups that history tells us were bitter enemies. The implications of this contact were staggering. It suggested that certain historical events might have been planned differently than we've been told. That certain knowledge was shared when it supposedly wasn't possible for that knowledge to be shared. It suggested that the official history might be wrong. And not just wrong. Deliberately wrong. Carbon dating confirmed the tablet's age instantly. 2,650 years old. Plus or minus 100 years. The scientific certainty was absolute. This wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a modern forgery. It was genuine. But age wasn't the most interesting finding. The most interesting finding came from analyzing the stone itself. The limestone used to carve the tablet came from a specific region. Geologists can identify where ancient stone originated by examining its mineral composition. The tests were conclusive. The stone came from quarries that existed in northern Palestine during the 7th century BCE. But here's the problem. The tablet also contained references to something that didn't exist in northern Palestine. Something that only existed in Egypt. Something that only existed in the southern Mediterranean. This meant one of two things. Either the tablet was created somewhere far from Jerusalem and brought there. Or it was created by people who had access to materials from distant regions. In a time when trade was limited. When travel was dangerous. When most people never left their own region. The implications were staggering. It suggested a level of international coordination that historians had insisted was impossible in that era. It suggested networks. Communication systems. Knowledge sharing between distant civilizations that supposedly didn't interact. One geologist involved in the analysis wrote a private memo to his superiors. That memo was later leaked. In it, he described finding trace elements in the stone that matched samples from multiple regions. Elements that shouldn't all be present in a single piece of limestone unless the stone had been formed in a place where multiple mineral sources mixed together naturally. Or unless someone had deliberately embedded these elements into the stone. The second option seemed impossible. How could ancient people embed minerals into stone? But the samples were real. The tests were reproducible. The evidence was undeniable. The tablet's surface also showed something curious. Microscopic scratches. The kind of marks that happen when a stone is worked with modern tools. But these scratches were on the underside. The side that had been sealed in the chamber for 2,600 years. No one could have added those marks after the tablet was buried. Which meant they had to have been made before. Researchers compared the scratches to modern tool marks. The patterns matched almost perfectly. Which shouldn't be possible. Ancient peoples didn't have metal tools that left these kinds of precise marks. Yet there they were. Undeniable. Inexplicable. The scientific community faced a crisis. The evidence was real. Reproducible. Verifiable. But it suggested something that couldn't possibly be true. It suggested that ancient people had access to tools or knowledge that shouldn't exist. It suggested technological capability that appeared nowhere else in the archaeological record. Some scientists proposed alternative explanations. Maybe the scratches were natural. Maybe the mineral composition was coincidental. Maybe the stone had been weathered in unusual ways. But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. The evidence simply didn't fit the accepted narrative. So the evidence was set aside. Not disproven. Just set aside. Deemed inconvenient. Classified as something best left unstudied. But you can't just stop asking questions. Not when the answers are right there. Not when the truth is literally staring at you through stone and time. History is written by people with authority. Kings write about their victories. Religious leaders write about their triumphs. The people who win get to decide how the story is told. Which means most of history is incomplete. Biased. Missing enormous pieces of what actually happened. The tablet threatened to add pieces that powerful people had worked very hard to keep missing. The inscription referenced what scholars called the hidden record. A phrase that appeared nowhere else in any known historical document. It was repeated 3 times on the tablet. Each time with different context. Each time suggesting that certain knowledge had been preserved. Kept safe. Passed down through select groups while the wider world remained ignorant. World finally understands what was buried beneath the holy city. The implications will reshape how we understand human history itself. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment when this story finally breaks free. Because the greatest discoveries aren't always the ones we make. Sometimes they're the ones that were waiting for us all along.